He slammed the door, a sound that cracked against the humid summer air. It wasn't just a door closing, it was a final, violent punctuation mark on everything we'd ever been. I stood on the dusty porch, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the sun beating down on my neck. My father, Lyle, was yelling through the screen, his face a contorted mask of rage and fear, his eyes wild. He wasn't looking at me, not really. He was looking at the future I represented, the past I embodied, the parts of his life he was desperate to scrub clean with a $56 million sponge. The anger wasn't new, not since the numbers came up, but this cold fury, this calculated cruelty was. I didn't shout back. There was no point. His words were a blur, a chaotic symphony of betrayal and entitlement. I just walked off the porch, feeling the weight of the duffel bag and a new terrible emptiness in my chest. I didn't turn back, not even when I heard the deadbolt slide home behind me. He had made his choice. My motorcycle was parked out front, a rusty, beloved relic from a time that felt 1,000,000 years ago. I swung a leg over it, the leather seat hot under my jeans, and kicked the starter. The engine coughed to life, a rough, defiant roar. He had a brand new Escalade in the driveway, a symbol of his new life, but he hadn't touched the old beast. The engine's rumble was a low, angry growl, and as I pulled away from the house, I could still feel the tremor of it in my hands. The roar filled the silence where his begging should have been, where his apology was now a ghost. What he didn't know was that in 3 days, all of that would change. Before I begin this story, can you tell me where in the world you're listening to from? The trailer shuddered when the old window unit kicked on, rattling the frames and sending a gust of lukewarm air through the small living room. It was a sound I'd known my whole life, a familiar, comforting part of home. My father, Lyle, sat across from me, on the floral-patterned couch, the one with the springs that dug into your thighs if you sat on it wrong. He was nursing a lukewarm coffee, his eyes glued to the old television set, its screen flickering with static before the news came on. He wasn't a man who had much, but he had an unwavering faith in the lottery numbers, a ritual he'd kept for as long as I could remember. Every Saturday night we'd sit there together, him with his ticket, me with my hands on the worn-out manual for the old '78 Yamaha motorcycle we were rebuilding in the garage. The bike was our shared dream, a project that had become a monument to our hope. We were scraping by, sure, but our poverty was a shared burden, a thing that had bound us together in a way that money never could. Our conversations weren't about luxury, they were about the small victories, like finding a rare part for the carburetor or getting a few more hours at the auto shop. Our ambitions were humble and our contentment was real. The news anchor's voice was a low hum, a backdrop to the quiet rhythm of our evening. The numbers flashed on the screen, a series of white digits against a bright blue background. I wasn't paying attention, not really. My mind was on the motorcycle. The frame was solid, the engine was almost there, but the wiring was a mess, and we still needed to source a new headlight. A few $100s was all we needed. That was the extent of our grand plan. But then I heard my father's breath catch in his throat, a sharp, choked sound. His hand, the one holding the coffee mug, was shaking violently. I looked up. His eyes, usually a calm, weary blue, were wide and disbelieving, fixed on the screen. He fumbled for his ticket, his fingers clumsily unfolding the creased paper. His thumb smeared the ink, but the numbers were still there, in perfect, impossible sequence. I looked at the screen and back at the ticket. One number matched, then another, then another. My heart started to pound. A quiet gasp escaped my own lips. The anchor was speaking about a single winner, about a life-altering jackpot. The number was $56 million. My father and I just stared at each other. There was a moment, a fragile, beautiful moment of pure, unadulterated joy. We were free. No more ramen for dinner, no more worrying about the light bill, no more begging for more hours at the garage. It was all over. We had won. The silence in the room was thick with possibility, with the sheer weight of what had just happened. For a moment it felt like nothing would change, that the money would just be a tool to make our lives better, to finally finish the motorcycle. I reached for him, my hand resting on his trembling shoulder. A smile, slow and genuine, spread across his face. He looked at me, his eyes full of a love that was 1,000 times richer than any jackpot. I truly believed, in that moment, that our bond was unbreakable, that this money would only strengthen what we had. He pulled me into a tight embrace, patting my back and laughing, a deep, joyful sound I hadn't heard in years. He whispered in my ear, a promise that felt as solid as a rock. "This is for us, Jackson. This is for our future. We can finally do everything we've ever wanted to do." The words were a balm, a shield against the years of hardship. I believed him completely. What I didn't know was that this moment was the peak, and it was all about to come crashing down. That hug wasn't a promise of our future. It was the last honest touch we would ever share. The paperwork was signed, the bank accounts were set up, and the money hit the account like a tidal wave. It didn't just change our situation, it changed the very air we breathed. Our small trailer, once a fortress of shared struggle and quiet pride, became a relic of a life Lyle was desperate to forget. He bought new clothes, shiny things with labels he couldn't even pronounce, and started driving a massive black SUV that looked absurd in our tiny driveway. Our dinners, once a simple affair of my mother, Odessa, cooking what she could from the pantry, were now at expensive steakhouses, where Lyle would order a bottle of wine and barely touch it, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting someone to snatch the gold from his pocket. The man who once found solace in the simple click of a wrench against a bolt now found himself mesmerized by the flash and spectacle of things he never wanted. He was living a life that wasn't his, and the more he tried to become this new person, the more he lost himself. He started talking to new people, slick, well-dressed men with empty smiles and polished shoes, who talked about investments and trusts. I would sit there, a silent observer, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I tried to talk to him about the motorcycle, about our shared project, but he'd just wave his hand dismissively. "We can buy a dozen of those, son. A brand new one. You don't have to get your hands dirty anymore." His voice, once warm and full of a simple, rugged honesty, was now a polished, rehearsed thing. He was adopting a new persona, a stranger in my own home. The money had turned him into something I didn't recognize. He started talking about getting a lawyer to protect our assets, as if the few trinkets we owned were suddenly in danger. The trust he once placed in me, in our small shared world, had been replaced with a deep, consuming paranoia. I tried to remind him of the promise he made to me, the promise to use the money to make our lives better, to finish the motorcycle and buy a real garage to work in. But he would just stare blankly at me, his face impassive. It was as if our past had been erased, a memory he had paid to have removed from his mind. He never once asked me what I wanted, what my dreams were. He simply assumed that his new life was my new life, and that I would follow him blindly down this path of gaudy excess and misplaced trust. My mother, Odessa, said nothing. She moved through the house with a quiet sadness, her eyes following my father like he was a stranger. She was trying to figure out. The final straw came when I found him in the garage, a place that was once our sanctuary. He was looking at the partially disassembled motorcycle, his eyes holding a look of contempt, a look I had never seen on his face before. He was talking to one of the slick men from the bank, pointing at the bike as if it were a rusted-out wreck to be hauled away. I felt a surge of cold dread in my chest. He was going to sell it, to get rid of it. The project that was a symbol of our love and our bond, a tangible representation of our shared dreams, was now an eyesore to him, a relic of a life he wanted to forget. I stepped into the garage, my voice calm but my heart pounding. "What are you doing, Dad?" I asked. He turned to me, a flicker of something, maybe shame, in his eyes before it was replaced with the hard, cold mask he had been wearing since the money. "Cleaning up," he said, his voice flat. He was going to sell it for parts. He explained to me that it was a liability, and that it didn't fit with their new, sophisticated image. This was his promise, a promise that he was going to break without even batting an eye. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The new house was a monument to Lyle's insecurity, a sprawling suburban fortress of polished wood and beige siding that stood out like a sore thumb in a neighborhood of modest homes. It had a 3-car garage, a manicured lawn he paid a crew to maintain, and an alarm system with more blinking lights than a Christmas tree. But inside it was a hollow, echoing shell. My mother, Odessa, had tried to decorate it, to give it some warmth, but the new furniture looked sterile and untouched, as if it were still a showroom floor. The place didn't feel like home. It felt like a trap, and we were all caught in it. Lyle's paranoia had gone from a quiet undercurrent to a screaming, full-blown storm. He had installed cameras everywhere, both inside and out, and he spent his days glued to a monitor, watching every movement, every shadow. He had cut off our old friends, the kind people who lived in our trailer park, the ones who had helped us put food on the table when times were tough. He told them he was too busy, too important now, but the real reason was fear. He was terrified that they would ask for a handout, and that was the one thing he couldn't bring himself to do. He had $1 million in the bank, but he was holding on to every penny as if it were his last. The trust fund lawyers, a pair of sharp-faced men in suits, were a constant presence. They were like Lyle's new best friends, always whispering in his ear about liability, about asset protection, about securing our future. They spoke a language of wealth and privilege that I didn't understand and didn't want to. I tried to talk to him about it, to remind him of who we were, of the simple, good people we had been before the money. But he just looked at me with a blank expression as if I was speaking a foreign language. "You don't get it, Jackson," he'd say, his voice full of a cold, weary impatience. "This isn't a game. This is our life. We have to protect it. We have to protect what we've worked so hard for." He didn't say we, he said I. I could feel the distance growing between us, a chasm that was widening with every passing day. The man I had once known was gone, replaced by a greedy, paranoid stranger who looked exactly like my father. The final straw came when a letter arrived for me, a formal document from his lawyers. It was a notice that he was putting my name on a different deed to protect a small plot of land we owned from a lawsuit that would never happen. I knew it was all nonsense, a way to keep everything separate. It felt like a small act of kindness, but I knew it was the opposite. It was a lie. I showed the letter to Odessa. She read it, her face pale and her hands started to shake. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness so deep I felt it in my own soul. She said nothing, but I knew what she was thinking. This was all a lie, a betrayal. It was an act of finality. This was the first of many things that he would do to hurt us. I felt a surge of cold anger, a sharp, unfamiliar emotion that cut through the sadness. I decided to confront him. I walked into his study, where he was once again staring at the security monitor. I slammed the letter down on the desk. He looked up, startled, his face full of a fleeting expression of something I couldn't place. I demanded an explanation, a real one, not another lie. The mask came back down and his eyes hardened. He said, "You're not part of this anymore, Jackson. This is my life now." And with that he stood up, his face grim, and told me he had a proposition for me. I should have known better. I should have seen it coming. But I didn't. The air in the study was thick with unspoken anger, a suffocating silence that felt heavier than a physical weight. My father, Lyle, stood across the polished mahogany desk, the light from the large window behind him, making him look like a dark, imposing silhouette. He didn't raise his voice, and that was what terrified me most. His voice was a flat, emotionless monotone, the voice of a man making a business transaction, not the voice of a father speaking to his son. "I've been thinking, Jackson," he said, his eyes scanning me as if I were a piece of furniture he was considering removing. "This isn't working. We've gone in different directions." The words were like a physical blow, a calculated cruelty that was worse than any shout. I stared at him, my mind reeling. My throat felt tight, and my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. How could we have gone in different directions? We were a family, he continued, his words falling into the air like shards of glass. "I need a clean break, a fresh start. And you're part of the old life, the old problems." He gestured around the extravagant room, the expensive art on the walls, the leather-bound books on the shelves, things that were utterly foreign to him, and to me. This was the life he had chosen, a life that had no room for the man he used to be, or the son who reminded him of it. I tried to speak, to argue, to make him see reason, but the words were stuck in my throat. He pulled a checkbook from a drawer, a sleek, new thing, and scribbled something on it. He tore the check out and placed it on the desk. My name was on it, the number a staggering $50,000. "This is your inheritance," he said, his voice void of any feeling. "It's more than you'd ever get. Take it and go." I looked at the check. The paper felt cold and alien. It wasn't a gesture of love. It was a payment, a severance package. He was paying me to disappear, to get out of his new life so he could pretend I never existed. The tears welled up in my eyes, hot and stinging. I didn't want the money. I wanted my father back, the man who taught me how to change a tire, the man who had worked himself to the bone to put food on our table, the man who had promised me we'd finish that motorcycle together. He was gone, replaced by this cold, soulless stranger. My voice, when it finally came out, was a raw, broken whisper. "You're throwing me out?" I asked. "After everything?" He looked at me, a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe a ghost of a memory, before the mask of greed and fear settled back in. "I'm giving you a head start," he said, his voice a calculated lie. "Don't come back. Don't call." The words echoed in my ears as I stood there, stunned. It was a rejection so absolute, so complete, that it felt like I had been erased from the world. I didn't touch the check. I didn't want his money. It was poisoned. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the check on the desk, a symbol of his hollow victory. I went to my room, grabbed my duffel bag and threw in a few shirts, the worn-out photo of me and my parents on my 8th birthday, and the keys to my motorcycle. I passed my mother, Odessa, in the hallway. Her face was a landscape of sorrow, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. The silent despair in her eyes was a reflection of my own. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the house. As I swung a leg over my motorcycle, I looked back at the house, a monument to a life I never wanted, and I felt a new kind of pain, a deep, aching wound that would never heal. I kicked the starter, and the engine roared to life, a defiant cry in the silence of his betrayal. The sound was a goodbye, a final punctuation mark. The first few days were a blur of cheap coffee and endless highway. The world felt smaller, meaner, without a place to call my own. I slept in the back of my van, parked behind a rusted-out gas station, the air thick with the smell of old exhaust and stale cigarettes. The $50,000 check was a ghost in my mind, a temptation I refused to consider. I had my motorcycle, the one true thing I owned, the only tangible link to the person my father used to be. It was more than a machine, it was a memory, a promise, a symbol of a love I now knew was a lie. My stomach was a knot of hunger and pain, and my mind was a chaotic symphony of questions. Why had he done it? What had I done to deserve this? I found myself staring at my phone, the screen dark, willing it to ring. I wanted to hear his voice, not with an apology, but with a simple explanation, a final act of honesty. But the phone was silent, a stark symbol of the new emptiness in my life. I was hunched over a cup of instant coffee, watching the rain streak down the grimy window, when my phone finally buzzed to life. My heart leaped into my throat, a sudden frantic rhythm that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It was him, my father, Lyle. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the green button. I was half expecting an apology, a tearful, desperate plea for forgiveness, but a part of me, the part that had been betrayed, was suspicious. I answered the call, my voice a raw, broken whisper. "Dad," I said. His voice, when it came through the static, was not what I had been expecting. It wasn't the cold, calculating tone he had used when he threw me out. It wasn't an apology. It was a desperate, panic sound, a high-pitched, frantic noise that sounded like a man drowning. "Jackson," he said, his voice cracking, "you have to listen to me. This is important." I held the phone to my ear, my hand trembling. "What is it?" I asked, my voice a little louder now, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe he had come to his senses. Maybe the money had finally proven to be the hollow prize that it was. Maybe he had realized he'd made a terrible mistake, but his next words shattered that fragile hope. "The motorcycle," he said, his voice filled with a desperate, frantic urgency. "Where is it? I need you to bring it back." Now, I felt a jolt of cold shock, as if I had been hit by a car. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He had thrown me out, rejected me, and now he was begging for the one thing I had left, the one true symbol of our shared past. He had a brand new Escalade, a sprawling mansion, $56 million, and he wanted my beat-up, rusty motorcycle. It was a request so absurd, so nonsensical, that it could only mean one thing. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. I couldn't process it. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the bizarre request. My heart, which had just started to beat a little faster with a glimmer of hope, now felt like a lead weight in my chest. "Why?" I asked, my voice a dead-end whisper. "Why do you need it?" He didn't answer. He just kept begging, his voice growing more and more frantic with every word. He told me it was a matter of life and death, that his entire future depended on it, but he wouldn't explain why. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling, my mind a storm of confusion. I stared at the motorcycle, a silent monument to our broken bond, and wondered what its secret was. What could a rusted piece of junk have that was more valuable than a son? The answer, I knew, was a secret so big, so dark, that it had to be worth more than a life. I knew in that moment that I had to go back. Not to get my father back, but to get answers. I stood in front of the diner, its neon sign flickering and buzzing like a tired insect. The place was a relic from a different era, a greasy spoon with chipped formica tables and worn-out red vinyl booths. It was a world away from the gilded cage he now called home. He was sitting in a booth in the back, hunched over a cup of coffee, his face pale and haggard. He looked like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the man I used to know. The crisp, new suit he was wearing looked out of place, a costume he was still learning to wear. He didn't look up when I walked in, his eyes fixed on the coffee mug, as if he were trying to find answers in its dark depths. I sat down across from him, the springs in the booth groaning in protest. The silence between us was thick with unspoken tension, a web of old hurts and new secrets. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The cold, calculating look was gone, replaced by a deep, consuming fear. "Jackson," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I know you have questions." I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, my gaze unwavering. He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he reached for the coffee cup. "The money," he said, "it's not what you think." He started to explain, the words coming out in a frantic, jumbled rush. The lottery win wasn't a sudden, miraculous windfall. It was a trap, a calculated move that had been years in the making. The ticket, it turned out, wasn't just a random piece of paper. It was part of a decades-old lawsuit, a legal battle that had been simmering for years, just waiting for the right moment to boil over. He had been fighting it since before I was born, a silent, all-consuming battle that had haunted him for years. The lottery ticket was a plant, a part of a larger scheme to lure him into a legal trap. The plaintiff, a man named Oswin, was a ruthless legal shark who had been lying in wait, and now he was ready to strike. The lottery win was a public spectacle, a way for Oswin to get Lyle to show his hand, to reveal his assets, to prove that he had the money to pay for a legal battle that had been waiting for him. The 56 million wasn't just money, it was a target, a bullseye on Lyle's back. He had been so blinded by the money, so desperate to escape the life he had, that he had walked right into the trap. The lawyers he had hired, the ones who had told him to cut me off, to get rid of everything, they were part of Oswin's plan. They were paid to make him an easy mark. They had convinced him that the only way to protect his assets was to sever all ties to his past, to liquidate everything, to make it seem as if he had nothing to hide. But there was one thing he hadn't told them about, one thing he couldn't bring himself to part with: the motorcycle. It was a relic from a different time, a symbol of a different life, and it held the key to the entire case. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading expression. "I told them I sold it," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I couldn't do it. It was ours, Jackson. It was all we had." He had risked everything for a rusty old bike, and now he was paying the price. The money, it turned out, was never his. It was a phantom, a lie that had been designed to lure him into a trap. And the motorcycle, the one thing he had been so desperate to get rid of, was the only thing that could save him. It wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a piece of evidence, a physical link to a secret that had been buried for decades. Oswin had a legal document, a contract signed by Lyle years ago, and the only way to prove it was a fraud was to bring the motorcycle back. I looked at him, and for the first time I felt something other than anger. I felt pity. My father, the man I had once believed to be a giant, was a small, terrified man, caught in a web of his own making. The money hadn't changed him, it had simply revealed the fear that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. My mind was reeling, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of my life. The story my father, Lyle, had just told me was so wild, so far-fetched, that it was almost impossible to believe. Yet, as I looked at the fear in his eyes, I knew it was the truth. The lottery win was a honeypot, a legal trap set by a man named Oswin. The lawyers, the paranoid secrecy, the cold dismissal of everything from our past, it all made a terrible, twisted sense. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was trying to protect himself, and in his misguided, fear-driven attempt, he had thrown me out with the rest of the garbage. But the motorcycle, it was the one part of his old life he couldn't bring himself to abandon. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sliver of hope, a hope that the father I had lost wasn't a greedy monster, but a terrified man who had lost his way. "So what does the motorcycle have to do with any of this?" I asked, my voice calm, the shock slowly giving way to a cold, calculating resolve. Lyle took a shaky breath, his eyes darting around the diner as if he expected Oswin to appear at any moment. "It's a token," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The original contract with Oswin. It was a lease agreement for a piece of land, a small piece of property, with an old dilapidated workshop. Oswin, he was a land speculator back then, and he had a reputation for swindling people out of their properties. The story was a painful one, a tale of a young, naive Lyle, desperate for a place to work on cars, who signed a lease agreement without a lawyer. The contract, it turned out, was a legal trap, a decades-old document that gave Oswin the right to claim any assets Lyle acquired in the future. But it was a fraud," Lyle said, his voice filled with a desperate conviction. "I found out later. The contract had been doctored. The original agreement was for the land, not for everything I owned. He had tried to fight it, but he had no money, no leverage. He was a small, insignificant man against a legal shark. But there was a problem with Oswin's legal document. It wasn't the original. The original was in a box, hidden away in the old workshop, and the only way to prove it was a fraud was to bring the motorcycle back. The motorcycle, it turned out, had a hidden compartment in the frame, a secret I had never known about. It was a token of his old life, a place where he had hidden the original contract with Oswin, the one that could save him. But it was also the one thing that was in my name, the one thing that Oswin couldn't claim. He had begged for it, not out of greed, but out of fear. Now I understood. He had thrown me out, not to get rid of me, but to protect me, to keep me and the motorcycle separate from his new, cursed life. Now the weight of the world felt like it was on my shoulders. I had a choice to make. I could just walk away, take the money he had given me, and live my own life. I could let him deal with the consequences of his own foolishness, or I could risk everything and help him, the man who had betrayed me. I looked at him, the man who had abandoned me. But I saw something else, too. I saw the man who had taught me how to rebuild an engine, the man who had worked 2 jobs to put food on our table, the man who had loved me. The choice was a heartbreaking one. I could let him drown, or I could risk everything to save him. The diner was a silent, suffocating box, the smell of old coffee and grease filling the air. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and I knew in that moment what I had to do. I had to help him. I had to prove that the bond we had was stronger than any amount of money, any amount of betrayal. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, walked to the door, and turned back to face him. "I'll be back," I said. "I'm going to get the motorcycle." His face, for the first time since I had seen him, broke into a small, fragile smile. He looked relieved, like a man who had just been saved from drowning. But I knew this was just the beginning. The first person I knew I had to go to was Cassidy. She was an old friend, a girl I had known since we were kids in the trailer park. She was the smart one, the one who had always talked about getting out, about going to law school. She had a quiet intelligence, a fierce determination that I had always admired. I hadn't seen her in years, not since she had packed up her old car and left for college. I found her in a small, cramped office on the 2nd floor of a building in the downtown district. The place smelled of old paper and lukewarm coffee. She was hunched over her desk, her long hair tied back in a messy bun, a pair of reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She looked up when I walked in, her face breaking into a wide, disbelieving smile. "Jackson," she said, her voice a soft, surprised whisper. We talked for a long time, the years melting away with every shared memory. I told her everything, the lottery win, the new house, the betrayal, and the shocking truth about the lawsuit and the motorcycle. She listened to me, her face a mask of quiet concentration, her eyes never leaving mine. She asked me questions not out of curiosity but out of a deep professional interest. She wanted to know every detail, every word my father had said, every document I had seen. She took notes, her hand a quick, steady blur on the legal pad. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "This is a mess, Jackson," she said, her voice low and serious. "A complete, legal mess. Your father walked right into a trap." But then she started to talk about the lawsuit. She had heard about Oswin, the man who was suing my father. He was a legal shark, she confirmed, a man who had made a career out of taking advantage of small, insignificant people. But the part about the motorcycle, the token, she said, her eyes narrowing. That's the part that doesn't make sense. If the motorcycle has the original contract, why is Oswin trying to get it back? Why would he want to destroy the very thing that could prove his case? I looked at her, and the light bulb went on. The lawsuit wasn't what it seemed. The original contract wasn't just a simple lease agreement. It was something else. She leaned forward, her voice a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. "Jackson," she said, "I think your father's been lied to. I don't think Oswin's been after your father's money. I think he's been after the motorcycle all along, and the lottery win was just a public spectacle, a way for him to find out who had it." The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The money was a lie, a distraction, a phantom prize designed to confuse and disorient. The real prize was the motorcycle, the one true thing that had been in my possession all along. The reason Lyle threw me out, the reason he begged for the motorcycle, it was all part of the same lie. He had been manipulated, tricked into believing that the money was his and that I was a liability. He had done all of this, had sacrificed our relationship for a lie. My heart sank, a cold, heavy feeling of despair. He had betrayed me, but he had been betrayed too. It was a tragedy on both sides. Cassidy looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet empathy. "Your father's in trouble, Jackson," she said, her voice soft. "And he's not the only one. If we're going to fight this, we have to expose the truth. But we can't do it without him." I knew what she meant. We had to go back to him, not as a son to a father, but as two men with a shared enemy. We had to confront the man who had lied to us both. We had to expose the secrets that had been buried for decades. The motorcycle, the token, the key to everything was now in my hands. I knew in that moment that I wasn't going to let it go. Not without a fight. The road ahead was long and difficult, and I knew that the man I had to confront was not just a legal shark, but a ghost from my father's past. The meeting with my father, Lyle, wasn't at a diner this time. I told him to meet me at the old abandoned workshop, the one where he had originally signed the contract with Oswin. The place was a ruin, a rotting shell of what it once was, its windows shattered, its doors hanging on by a single, rusty hinge. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. He was standing in the middle of the empty garage, a small, insignificant man in a brand new suit, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected a ghost to appear. I pulled up on my motorcycle, its engine a low, defiant growl in the silence. I got off, the keys clutched in my hand, and walked into the workshop. He looked at me, a flicker of something, maybe shame, maybe fear, in his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the motorcycle, a symbol of everything he had tried to throw away. "I know," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I know what's going on, Dad. I know about the lawsuit, and I know about the motorcycle." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. "How did you?" he started to ask, but I cut him off. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that I know the truth. I know that the lottery win was a lie. I know that Oswin's been after the motorcycle all along, and I know that you were a fool to believe them." The words were harsh, but they were true. He was a fool, and his foolishness had cost us everything. The power had shifted. He was no longer the one with the money, with the power. I was. I had the motorcycle, the key to his freedom, the one thing he couldn't buy, couldn't lie about, couldn't get back. I walked over to the motorcycle, my hand resting on its rusted frame. "In 3 days," I said, my voice a low, hard whisper. "You begged me for this. You told me it was a matter of life and death, but you wouldn't tell me why. You threw me out, Dad, and you did it for a lie." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, consuming sorrow. "I was scared, Jackson," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "I didn't know what to do. The lawyers told me to sever all ties. They told me you were a liability." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt no anger. I felt a quiet, simmering rage at Oswin, the man who had manipulated him, who had used his greed and fear against him. "I know," I said, "but that's not an excuse. You betrayed me, Dad. You chose money over your son." The words hung in the air, a final, undeniable truth. He looked at me, a tear tracing a single lonely path down his cheek. "I know," he said. "I'm so sorry." The apology was raw, honest, and filled with a pain that was a mirror image of my own. He told me the whole story, the one he had never told me before. He told me about the young man he had been, the one who had been so desperate to prove his worth, so eager to succeed, that he had fallen for a lie. He told me about the lawsuit, about the decades of fear and secrecy, about the constant dread that had haunted his life. He told me about Oswin, a man who had used his own greed and fear against him. He told me everything. When he was finished, he looked at me, his eyes pleading. "The motorcycle," he said, "it has the original contract. It's the only thing that can save me." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate hope, a hope that was a mirror image of the hope I had felt in the diner. I had a choice to make, a heartbreaking choice. I could leave him to his fate, let him deal with the consequences of his own choices, or I could help him and risk everything in the process. I knew what I had to do. I had to help him, but first he had to prove that he was willing to fight, not just for the money, but for me. The look on his face, the raw, honest plea in his eyes, was all the proof I needed. I didn't say the words, but the plan was clear in my mind. We were going to fight back. Not with money, not with lawyers, but with the truth. I told him to go back to the new house, to act as if everything was normal, to continue with the facade of his new, lavish life. He was a pawn in Oswin's game, and he was going to play his part perfectly. I would be the wild card, the ghost in the machine. I would bring in Cassidy, my lawyer friend, and together we would expose the truth. We would use his fear against him. I told him to arrange a meeting with Oswin, a final, in-person confrontation. I told him to lie, to tell Oswin that he had found the motorcycle and that it was for sale. It was a risky plan, a dangerous one, but it was the only way. Oswin would be a fool to pass up the opportunity. He would want the motorcycle, the one piece of evidence that could expose his fraud. He would think he had won, that he had finally gotten what he wanted. He would walk right into our trap. Lyle looked at me, a flicker of something, maybe disbelief, maybe fear in his eyes. He had been so used to running, so used to lying, that the idea of standing up and fighting was a foreign concept to him. "But Jackson," he said, his voice a low, anxious whisper, "what about the money? We'll lose everything." I looked at him and I knew what he was really asking. He was asking if I was going to abandon him again, if I was going to walk away when the going got tough. "It's not about the money, Dad," I said, my voice firm. "It's about the truth. It's about you. It's about getting our life back." The words were a quiet, unspoken promise. I wasn't fighting for the money. I was fighting for him. I was fighting for the man he used to be. The sacrifice was unspoken, but it was there, hanging in the air between us. I was risking everything. I was risking my future, my freedom, and my life to save the man who had betrayed me. He agreed. He didn't have to say a word. His eyes, for the first time in a long time, held a flicker of the old man I used to know, the man who was honest, who was kind, who was my father. He gave me the keys to his new Escalade, a symbolic gesture of his trust. "Take it," he said. "You'll need a way to get around." I took the keys, and the feel of them in my hand was a strange, unsettling feeling. It was a symbol of his new life, a life I didn't want, but I was going to use it to fight for the life we had both lost. I left the workshop, leaving him alone in the dust and decay, the man who had found his way back home, a broken and humbled man. I drove to Cassidy's office, the car a silent, luxurious ghost on the highway. We worked for the rest of the night, going over the legal documents, the contract, the lawsuit, everything. We were building a case, a story of betrayal and manipulation, a story that would expose Oswin for who he really was. The plan was simple, but dangerous. We were going to lure Oswin into a meeting, a public place where he would be forced to show his hand. We would expose his fraud, and we would do it with the one thing he couldn't get his hands on. The motorcycle. I knew that it was going to be the most difficult thing I had ever done. It was going to require me to be strong, to be a man, and to be a son. I was fighting for him, for our family, and for the promise we had both made to ourselves. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. The money was a lie, a phantom prize. The real prize was the truth, and I was going to get it. I was going to find out what had been in the hidden compartment of the motorcycle all along. The meeting was set for a public library, a quiet, unassuming place that was a world away from the cutthroat world of legal maneuvering and financial fraud. Oswin was there, a man in a tailored suit, his face a mask of polished indifference. He was a professional, a predator, and he was here to take what he believed was his. My father, Lyle, was there too, sitting across from him at a small table, his face pale and haggard, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was playing his part perfectly, a broken, defeated man. I was sitting at a table in the back, a silent observer, watching every move, every gesture, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had the motorcycle parked outside, a rusty, beloved monument to our past. Cassidy, my lawyer friend, was with me, her eyes a sharp, analytical gaze, her hand on a small leather-bound briefcase. Oswin started to talk, his voice a low, condescending hum. He was talking about the lawsuit, about the lottery money, about the fortune he was owed. He was lying, and he was doing it with a cold, practiced ease. He was so confident, so sure of his victory, that he didn't even bother to hide his contempt. He was a shark, and he was here to finish the job. My father, Lyle, just sat there, his head bowed, his hands trembling. He was a picture of defeat, a man who had been taken for everything he owned. Oswin, seeing his victory, leaned forward, a small, smug smile on his face. "You know, Lyle," he said, his voice a quiet, cruel whisper, "I always knew you'd be a good little runner. You never had the guts to stand up and fight." The words were like a physical blow, a calculated cruelty that was worse than any shout. I felt a surge of cold anger, a sharp, unfamiliar emotion. I wanted to stand up, to yell, to tell him that he was wrong, but I didn't. I just sat there, my gaze unwavering, my heart a frantic drum. Then, Oswin did what I knew he would do. He brought up the motorcycle. "I understand you have an asset you neglected to mention," he said, his voice still a low, cruel whisper. "The old motorcycle, the one that was in the original contract." My father, Lyle, looked up, a flicker of something, maybe fear, in his eyes. Oswin leaned back in his chair, a look of pure triumph on his face. "I'm willing to offer you a deal, Lyle," he said. "Give me the motorcycle and I'll drop the lawsuit." It was a lie, a trap, and it was a perfect one. He didn't want to drop the lawsuit. He just wanted the motorcycle, the one true piece of evidence that could expose his fraud. He had played his hand, and now it was our turn. I stood up and walked to the table, my heart a frantic drum. Oswin looked up, a look of surprise on his face. He didn't recognize me. He didn't know who I was. I was a ghost from his past, a wild card he had never anticipated. I walked to the table, my hand reaching for my pocket. I pulled out a small rusty key, the key to the motorcycle, and placed it on the table. The look on his face was priceless. He went from surprise to a cold, calculating rage. "Who are you?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, and I reached into the briefcase, a small black object clutched in my hand. It was the original contract, the one I had found in the hidden compartment of the motorcycle. It was old, brittle, and covered in a thin layer of dust. I placed it on the table, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated terror. He had lost. He had been beaten at his own game. He had spent decades planning this, years waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now he had been defeated by a rusty old motorcycle and a son he had tried to throw away. The truth, in that moment, felt more valuable than all the money in the world. It was a victory, a redemption, and a new beginning. The victory, however, was short-lived. Oswin, a man who had made a career out of fighting dirty, was not going to go down without a fight. He looked at the contract, his eyes filled with a simmering, cold rage. He was defeated, and he knew it. He had lost. But he had a card up his sleeve, a final, desperate move he had been holding in reserve. He leaned back in his chair, a small, cruel smile on his face. "This is a forged document," he said, his voice a low, confident hum. "This is a fraud." My heart sank. I knew he was going to say that. I knew he would try to discredit the document. But what he did next I didn't see coming. He pulled out a phone, a sleek, new device, and made a call. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know who he was talking to, but I knew it was someone who had the power to stop us. He hung up the phone and looked at me, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. "The man who notarized the original contract," he said, his voice a low, cruel whisper. "He's gone. He's disappeared. You have no one to prove that this document is real." I felt a jolt of cold shock, as if I had been hit by a car. I hadn't thought about that. I had been so focused on getting the contract, on exposing the fraud, that I had forgotten the most important part, the witness. Without a witness, the document was worthless. It was just an old piece of paper. He had beaten us. He had planned this, too. He had known that this was a possibility, and he had been holding on to this secret for decades, just waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart sank, a cold, heavy feeling of despair. We had won the battle, but we had lost the war. My father, Lyle, looked at me, his face pale and haggard, his eyes filled with a deep, consuming despair. He had trusted me, he had put his faith in me, and I had failed him. I had walked him right into a trap. I looked at Cassidy, and she just shook her head, her face a mask of quiet resignation. "He's right, Jackson," she said, her voice a low, sad whisper. "Without a witness, the document is worthless. We have nothing. The victory we had felt just moments before was a phantom, a mirage in a desert of defeat. We were back to where we started. My father was still a victim, and Oswin was still a predator. We had walked right into his trap, and we had no way out. The library, once a place of quiet refuge, was now a silent, suffocating tomb. The air was thick with the smell of defeat, and the silence was a constant, gnawing presence. I looked at my father, and I saw a man who had lost everything. He had lost his money, his home, his dignity, and now he was about to lose his freedom. All because of a lie that had been buried for decades. I wanted to help him. I wanted to fight for him. But I had no ammunition. I had no weapon. I had no way out. The truth, I had thought, was the most powerful weapon. But it was nothing without proof. And the proof was gone. We were at a dead end, and there was no way out. But as I sat there, defeated, I saw a familiar face in the back of the library. It was my mother, Odessa. She was sitting there, a small, quiet figure in a floral dress, her hands clasped in her lap. She had been watching us all along. The look on her face was not one of despair or resignation. It was one of quiet, fierce determination. She had a secret she had been holding for decades. Odessa, my mother, stood up from her chair, a small, quiet figure in the middle of a tense, dramatic scene. My father, Lyle, and Oswin looked at her, their faces a mask of surprise. She was a ghost, a woman they had both forgotten existed, a woman who had been silent for decades. She walked to our table, her gaze unwavering, and she placed a small, worn-out leather box on the table. It was a beautiful, intricate thing, and I had never seen it before. Oswin scoffed, a look of pure contempt on his face. "And what is this? An old jewelry box?" he asked, his voice a low, condescending hum. He was so confident, so sure of his victory, that he couldn't see the danger in front of him. He had no idea what was in that box, or what she had been holding in her heart for so long. Odessa didn't say a word. She just opened the box, her hands trembling. Inside was a small, worn-out photo, a black and white photograph of a young man, a man I didn't recognize, standing next to a beautiful young woman. The man was my father, Lyle, but he was a younger, happier, more innocent version of himself. And the woman was a complete stranger to me. But she wasn't a stranger to Oswin. The look on his face, a look of pure, unadulterated terror, was all the proof I needed. "This is a photo of the man who notarized the original contract," my mother said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "His name was Felix, and he was my brother." My father, Lyle, looked at her, a look of pure shock on his face. He had no idea. He had been fighting this battle for decades, and he had no idea that his wife's brother was the key to his freedom. Oswin was stunned. He had been holding on to this secret for decades, and now it was out in the open. He had been lying all along. The original contract, the one he had been trying to get his hands on, was a fraud. The man who had notarized it, my uncle Felix, was a witness to his lies. Oswin had been trying to get rid of my father, to get rid of the lawsuit, to get rid of the money, to get rid of everything, so he could take what he had wanted all along. He had been trying to get rid of the lottery money, which was a new revenue source, so he could claim that he had been owed money all along. But he was actually a land speculator trying to take my father's life. The lottery money was never the prize was the land, and the business that my father was running on it. Oswin had been lying, and now he had been exposed. The silence in the library was thick with the weight of the moment. The truth, the real, undeniable truth, was finally out. Oswin just stood there, his face pale and haggard. He had been beaten, and he knew it. He had been so close to victory. And now it was all over. He turned and walked away, a defeated man, a shadow of the predator he had once been. The lawsuit was over. The money was safe, but the family was still broken. My father, Lyle, looked at my mother, his face a landscape of sorrow. "Odessa," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, consuming sorrow. "I wanted to," she said, "but you were so full of fear, so full of greed. I was scared that the truth would only make things worse. And in that moment I understood everything. The lies, the secrets, the years of quiet despair. She had been protecting him, protecting me, protecting our family. She had been holding on to this secret, waiting for the right moment, waiting for us to come to our senses. Now we were free, but the scars were still there, and it was going to take a long time to heal. The library was empty now, the silence a peaceful, comforting presence after the storm. My father, Lyle, my mother, Odessa, and I were the only ones left. The lawsuit was over. The money was safe, the truth was out, but the healing had just begun. My father, Lyle, sat at the table, his head bowed, his hands clasped together in his lap. He looked at my mother, his eyes filled with a deep, consuming shame. "Odessa," he said, his voice a low, broken whisper. "I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. I should have told you." He was a broken, humbled man. He had lost his dignity, his pride, and his sense of self. He had sacrificed his family for a lie, and he was paying the price. My mother, Odessa, looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet love. "I know," she said, her voice a soft, gentle whisper. "I know." She walked over to him and put her hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of forgiveness, a quiet, unspoken confession of her love. She had been there for him, for me, for all of us. Through all of it, she had been a silent guardian, a quiet protector, and a fierce warrior. He had been fighting a war he didn't even know was happening, and she had been his armor all along. Now he finally saw it. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, consuming shame. "Jackson," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry. I should have never thrown you out. I was a fool." The apology was raw, honest, and filled with a pain that was a mirror image of my own. I had been hurt, but I had also learned something. I had learned that my father was just a man. He wasn't a god. He was a flawed, broken, vulnerable human being who had made a terrible mistake. He was just like me. The unspoken confession was in the air, a silent, powerful presence. He had confessed his shame, his greed, his fear, and his vulnerability. And I had confessed my own. I had confessed my anger, my hurt, my betrayal. We had both been broken, and now we were ready to heal. My father stood up, and he walked to the old, battered motorcycle, the one that had been the cause of all this chaos. He put his hand on the seat, a small, gentle gesture. "I'm going to give this back to you, son," he said, his voice a low, steady whisper. It was never about the money. It was about you. It was about us. The words were a quiet, unspoken promise. He was not giving me the bike. He was giving me back our relationship. He was giving me back my father. We left the library, the three of us, a small, silent family. We walked to the old, battered motorcycle, the one that had been a monument to our broken bond, and we got on it. My father got on, and my mother got on behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. I got on behind her, my arms wrapped around her. We were a family again, a quiet, silent presence in the world. We didn't talk. We didn't have to. The silence was a language all its own, a language of love, of forgiveness, of redemption. We drove away from the library, away from the past, and towards a new future, a future that was not about money, but about love and about forgiveness. The road ahead was long, but we were ready. We were ready to heal. Months had passed since that day, and the world had settled back into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. We hadn't moved into the new house. My father, Lyle, had sold it, and he had given a large portion of the money to a charity, a quiet, anonymous gesture of redemption. The rest of the money he had put into a trust fund for my mother, Odessa, a way to show her that he was truly sorry for the fear and the hurt he had caused her. We had gone back to our old trailer, the one with the shaky air conditioner and the sagging porch. It felt more like home than any place with polished floors and expensive art could ever be. It was a monument to our past, a quiet, humble place where we had learned to love each other and where we had learned to forgive. My father and I were in the garage, a place that was once our sanctuary, now a place of quiet, peaceful work. The motorcycle was almost finished. The frame was solid, the engine was running, and the new headlight was shining bright. It was a beautiful, powerful thing, a symbol of our new beginning. We were working together, side by side, our hands covered in grease, our faces smudged with dirt. It was a comfortable, familiar feeling, a feeling of being home. He was a different man now. The fear and the greed were gone, replaced by a quiet, humble wisdom. He had learned his lesson, a painful, difficult lesson, but a lesson he had learned all the same. He was a better man now, a man who was not defined by his mistakes, but by his redemption. The money was gone, but something else had taken its place, something more valuable than any jackpot. We had our family back, we had our love back, we had our home back. The past was still there, a ghost in our memories, but it was no longer a source of pain. It was a lesson, a story we would tell to our children, a story of how a man had lost everything and how he had found it again, not in money but in love. My mother, Odessa, walked into the garage, a small, quiet figure in a floral dress. She had a tray with 3 cups of coffee on it. She handed one to me, one to my father, and she kept one for herself. She didn't say a word, she just smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile that lit up the room. We sat there, the 3 of us, a quiet, silent family, drinking our coffee and watching the sun go down. The motorcycle was finished. My father looked at me, and he handed me the keys. "It's yours, son," he said, his voice a low, gentle whisper. "It was always meant to be yours." I took the keys, and the feel of them in my hand was a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy. I had lost a father, and I had found a man. I had lost my home, and I had found my family. I had lost everything, and I had found everything. The sun had set, and the moon was a quiet, gentle presence in the sky. The world was at peace, and so was I. The past was gone, and the future was ours to create. The road ahead was long, but we were ready. We were ready to ride.